Caution. The Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Before we begin tonight's story, it's worth asking a simple question. What exactly is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is a type of folk story passed down through generations, often long before it was ever written down. These stories were told around fires, in homes, and in village squares, slowly changing with each telling. Despite the name, fairy tales do not always involve fairies. Instead, they usually contain magical elements, strange creatures, curses, transformations, and impossible journeys. Many of the versions we know today were recorded in the 19th century by collectors like the brothers Grimm, but the stories themselves are often far older. And while modern audiences think of fairy tales as stories for children, the earliest versions were rarely so gentle. They were cautionary tales, moral lessons, and reflections of the fears and dangers of the world in which they were told. Tonight's story is one of those tales. And like many stories that have survived for centuries, the darker details are often the ones people forget. Before we begin tonight's story, a small fairy tale fact. Cinderella is one of the oldest and most widespread fairy tales ever recorded. Versions of the story appear across cultures and centuries, long before the one most people know today. Tonight we open another page in the dark origins of fairy tales. Episode 1, Cinderella, the version they didn't tell you. Most people believe they know the story of Cinderella. A young girl is mistreated by her stepmother and stepsisters. Through magic and kindness, she attends a royal ball. A glass slipper reveals her identity, and she marries the prince. It is a story of hope, of dreams rewarded, and of happily ever after. But the story most people know today is not the original. Not even close. One of the earliest recorded Cinderella-type stories comes not from Germany or France, but from ancient Greece. The story was written down by the Greek historian Strabo. It tells the story of a young Greek slave girl named Rhodopis living in Egypt. One day, while she is bathing, an eagle swoops down and steals one of her sandals. The bird flies away and drops the sandal into the lap of the Egyptian king. The king is amazed by the delicate shoe and becomes convinced that its owner must be someone extraordinary. He orders a search across the land to find the woman whose foot fits the sandal. Eventually, the search leads to Rhodopis. When the sandal fits her perfectly, the king marries her. The story contains no fairy godmother, no pumpkin carriage, and no glass slipper. But the central idea remains the same. A lost shoe, a search across the kingdom, and a girl whose life is changed forever. The version familiar to modern audiences was popularized by the French writer Charles Perrault in 1697. In that telling, we find the elements most people recognize: a fairy godmother, a pumpkin carriage, glass slippers, and a magical night that ends at midnight. It is a gentle story, meant to entertain and inspire. But when the tale was later collected by the brothers Grimm in their famous 1812 collection, Grimm's Fairy Tales, the tone was very different, much darker, and far closer to the harsh moral lessons common in old European folklore. In the Grimm version, the girl is known as Aschenputtel. There is no fairy godmother. Instead, Cinderella plants a tree on her mother's grave. Each day she visits the grave and waters the tree with her tears. Over time, the tree grows, and white birds begin to perch in its branches. When Cinderella wishes for help, the birds answer. They drop beautiful dresses and silver shoes from the branches so she may attend the prince's festival. But the prince does not recognize her. Each night she escapes before he can discover her identity. Eventually the prince spreads pitch on the palace steps so that one of the mysterious maiden's shoes will stick. This time the plan works. A golden slipper is left behind. The prince announces that he will marry the woman whose foot fits the shoe. And this is where the story turns darker. The sisters' desperation. When the prince arrives at Cinderella's house, the stepmother encourages her daughters to try on the slipper, but their feet are too large. So the mother gives them a knife. The first sister cuts off her toes. She forces her foot into the shoe. The prince believes she is the mysterious maiden and rides away with her. But as they pass the grave of Cinderella's mother, the white birds cry out, "Look back! Look back! The shoe is too small! There is blood in the shoe!" The prince looks down and sees blood pouring from the slipper. He realizes the deception and returns. The second sister tries. This time she cuts off her heel. Again she rides away with the prince. And again the birds reveal the truth. Finally the prince asks if there is another daughter in the house. Cinderella is brought forward. The slipper fits perfectly. The grim ending. The prince marries Cinderella, but the story does not end with the wedding. At the ceremony the two stepsisters attend, hoping to gain favor with the new queen. As they walk beside Cinderella, the white birds swoop down. One pecks out the eye of the first sister. The other blinds the second. According to the story, they are condemned to wander blind for the rest of their lives, punished for their cruelty and deception. In early fairy tales, justice was rarely gentle. An even older Cinderella. But the Grimm version was not the beginning of the story either. One of the oldest known Cinderella-like tales appears in China during the 9th century. It was recorded in the collection, Yu Yang Zazu. In that story, a girl named Ye Xian lives with a cruel stepmother. Her only friend is a magical fish. When the stepmother discovers the fish, she kills it. But Ye Xian keeps the fish bones, which possess magical powers. With their help, she attends a festival wearing beautiful clothes. Like Cinderella, she loses a shoe while fleeing the crowd. The shoe is discovered by a king, who becomes obsessed with finding the woman whose foot fits it. Eventually, Ye Xian is discovered and marries the king. The story contains many of the same elements that appear later in Europe, which suggests something fascinating. The Cinderella story may have traveled across continents for centuries before ever appearing in a European fairy tale book. Why fairy tales were so dark. Stories like Cinderella were never originally meant only for children. They were part of oral storytelling traditions that pass down lessons about morality, survival, and justice. Cruelty was punished, kindness was rewarded, and the consequences were often extreme because the lesson needed to be clear. These tales reflected the harsh realities of the world in which they were told. A world where life could be brutal and justice was rarely gentle. Today, the story of Cinderella is remembered as a tale of magic and romance, but hidden inside that familiar story are fragments of something much older. A tale that traveled across continents, changed shape through centuries, and carried a darker message than the one most of us remember. Because long before fairy tales became bedtime stories, they were warnings. The story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Sorry, Star Trek fans. Pavel Chekhov was wrong in believing that Cinderella was a Russian epic. I found no proof of this while doing research for this story. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Bonus story. While Cinderella became one of the most famous fairy tales ever told, many lesser-known stories share similar themes of disguise, hardship, and hidden identity. One such tale comes from the German collection of the brothers Grimm and is known as Catskin or Allerleiro. In this darker story, a king loses his beloved queen. Before her death, she makes him promise that if he ever remarries, it must only be to a woman as beautiful as she was. Years pass, and the king eventually realizes that the only woman who matches his late queen's beauty is his own daughter. The princess is horrified and desperately tries to avoid the marriage. To delay the wedding, she asks her father for impossible gifts: a dress as golden as the sun, a dress as silver as the moon, and a dress as radiant as the stars. The king provides them all. With no other way to escape, the princess disguises herself in a cloak made from the skins of animals and flees the castle. Covered in filth and fur, she hides her identity and becomes a servant in another kingdom's kitchen. By day she appears as nothing more than a ragged girl called Catskin, but at night she secretly wears the magical dresses she brought with her. Eventually, the prince of that kingdom discovers her true identity during a series of royal celebrations. Just like Cinderella, the mystery of the girl in disguise leads to her recognition and marriage. But unlike Cinderella, the darker shadow of the tale remains. A princess forced to flee her own father to escape a fate she could not accept. Stories like Catskin remind us that many fairy tales were not simply stories of magic and happy endings. They were reflections of fear, danger, and survival in a far harsher world. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in the dark origins of fairy tales, why not subscribe? It's free, I promise. Turn on notifications and never miss another chapter. Leave a comment. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know the dark origin? Let us know. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. It really helps us out. We hope you've enjoyed this dark origins of fairy tales. Return next week for a new episode, Sleeping Beauty, the story that shouldn't be a bedtime tale. Disclaimer: the Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Before we begin tonight's story, a small fairy tale fact. The story of Sleeping Beauty is far older and stranger than the version most people recognize today. One of the earliest recorded versions appears in the 17th century, written by the Italian author Giambattista Basile, in a tale called Sun, Moon, and Talia. Later versions of the story were softened considerably. The French writer Charles Perrault reshaped the tale in late 1600s, and in the 19th century, the brothers Grimm recorded their own version, which most modern retellings are based on. But the earliest versions remind us that many fairy tales were never meant to be gentle stories for children. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, They were warnings. Stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. Episode 2. Sleeping Beauty. The story that shouldn't be a bedtime tale. Most people know the story of Sleeping Beauty. A princess is cursed by a wicked fairy. On her 16th birthday, she pricks her finger on a spinning wheel and falls into a deep, magical sleep. 100 years later, a prince arrives. He kisses the princess, and the spell is broken. It is one of the most famous fairy tales in the world. But like many fairy tales, the version most people know today is not the original. The version popularized by Sleeping Beauty comes from earlier French and German adaptations. In the late 1600s, the writer Charles Perrault published a version in which the sleeping princess is awakened by a prince. Later, the brothers Grimm recorded their own telling, but both of these versions were already softened. The earliest known literary version of the story is far darker. In 1634, the Italian writer Giambattista Basile published a collection of stories called The Pentamerone. Inside this book appears a tale titled Sun, Moon, and Talia. This is one of the earliest recorded versions of Sleeping Beauty. In Basile's story, a noble girl named Talia falls into a deep sleep after a piece of flax becomes lodged beneath her fingernail. Her father, believing she has died, places her in a great house in the woods. Time passes. One day, a king riding through the forest discovers the sleeping girl. He cannot wake her. What happens next is something modern fairy tales no longer include. The king assaults Talia while she remains unconscious. Then he leaves. Months later, while still asleep, Talia gives birth to twins. The babies eventually remove the piece of flax from her finger, breaking the enchantment. She wakes and names the children Sun and Moon. But the story is far from over. The king eventually returns and discovers Talia alive with the children. There is only one problem. The king is already married. When the queen discovers the existence of Talia and the children, she becomes consumed with jealousy. She orders the twins to be killed. According to the story, she intends to have them cooked and served to the king as a meal. The cook secretly saves the children and prepares another dish instead. The queen then orders Talia herself to be burned alive. But the king learns of the plot before it can be carried out. The queen is executed, and the king marries Talia. While the older versions of Sleeping Beauty told of curses, enchanted sleep, and the triumph of a prince, modern storytellers have often returned to the tale and reshaped it for new audiences. One of the most notable reinterpretations came with the release of the film Maleficent. Rather than telling the story from the princess's perspective, this version shifts the focus entirely to the character who once served as the villain. In the traditional fairy tale, the wicked fairy curses the princess out of spite after being excluded from a royal celebration. But in this retelling, Maleficent is not simply evil. She begins as a powerful guardian of a magical forest kingdom, living in peace among strange and beautiful creatures. As a young fairy, she forms a close friendship with a human boy named Stefan. Over time, their friendship grows into something deeper. but ambition and betrayal eventually tear them apart. Stefan seeks power in the human kingdom and ultimately betrays Maleficent in a terrible act that leaves her physically and emotionally wounded. Consumed by anger and heartbreak, Maleficent later attends the celebration of the newborn Princess Aurora and places the famous curse upon the child. Before the king and queen, she declares that on her 16th birthday, the princess will prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and fall into a deep sleep. Unlike the traditional fairy tale, however, the story continues to explore Maleficent's regret and her complicated relationship with the princess as Aurora grows. This modern interpretation reflects how many classic fairy tales have been reshaped over time. Characters once portrayed as purely wicked are given deeper motives, and stories that were once simple moral warnings become more complex explorations of betrayal, forgiveness, and redemption. Yet beneath these new interpretations, the shadow of the older story still remains. The tales of a sleeping princess, an enchanted curse, and a world waiting for the moment when the spell is finally broken. Why fairy tales were so dark? Stories like this were not originally written for children. They were part of an adult storytelling tradition filled with warnings, moral lessons, and reflections of the harsh realities of life. Over time, many of these tales were rewritten and softened. The darker elements were removed, the endings became happier, and the stories slowly transformed into the fairy tales we recognize today. Today, Sleeping Beauty is remembered as a romantic story about a princess awakened by true love. But hidden beneath the version we know lies an older story, one shaped by darker ideas about fate, power, and justice. A reminder that the fairy tales we grew up with often began as something very different, because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. While the story of Sleeping Beauty tells of a princess trapped in enchanted sleep, the folklore collected by the brothers Grimm contains other strange tales of people imprisoned by magic. One of these lesser-known stories is called The Glass Coffin. In this tale, a young tailor wanders deep into the mountains searching for work. While traveling through the forest, he meets a mysterious deer who leads him to a hidden castle carved into the side of a mountain. Inside the castle, the tailor discovers something extraordinary. A beautiful young woman, lying perfectly still inside a coffin made entirely of glass. She is alive, but trapped by a powerful enchantment. The castle itself is under the control of a wicked magician who has imprisoned the young woman and transformed her brother into the very deer that led the tailor there. Hidden within the castle is a small wooden box containing a crystal key. When the tailor opens it, the enchantment begins to break. The glass coffin shatters, the young woman awakens, and the spell over the castle collapses. Her brother is restored to human form, and the wicked magician's power is finally destroyed. In gratitude for his courage, the tailor marries the young woman he helped free. Stories like The Glass Coffin remind us that long before the tale of Sleeping Beauty became famous, many fairy tales told of people caught between life and sleep, imprisoned by magic, and waiting for someone brave enough to break the spell. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in the dark origins of fairy tales, why not subscribe? It's free, I promise. Turn on notifications and never miss another chapter. Leave a comment. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know the dark origin? Let us know. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. It really helps us out. We hope you've enjoyed this dark origins of fairy tales. Return next week for a new episode. Snow White, the Queen's Cruel Punishment. Hello, welcome, or welcome back. Come on in. Have a seat. I'm about to begin the story. You don't want to miss this one. The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. Episode 3. Snow White, the Queen's Terrifying Punishment. This one works perfectly because everyone knows the basic story, but almost nobody knows how the Grimm version actually ends. The tale was recorded by the brothers Grimm in their 1812 collection, Grimm's Fairy Tales. And the ending is far darker than most modern retellings. The tale we recognize today first appeared in the collection in the early 19th century, but even then it was already an old story that had been passed down through generations. In the earliest versions, Snow White was not simply a princess rescued by kindness and love. Her story was darker, more brutal, and filled with repeated attempts on her life. The jealous queen does not try to kill Snow White only once. Instead, she tries several times. First, she disguises herself as an old peddler woman and laces Snow White into a bodice so tightly that the girl collapses and nearly suffocates. Later, the queen returns again, this time with a poisoned comb which she places into Snow White's hair. Only after those two attempts fail does the queen finally turn to the famous poisoned apple. Modern retellings often remove these earlier murder attempts, leaving only the apple. But the original Grimm version shows a far more determined villain. The queen is not satisfied until she is certain the girl is dead. It is a reminder that many fairy tales were originally meant to be cautionary stories about jealousy, vanity, and the dangers that can hide behind a friendly face. Disclaimer: the Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were warnings, stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. Most people know the story of Snow White. A jealous queen asks her magic mirror a simple question: who is the fairest of them all? When the mirror declares Snow White the most beautiful, the queen orders the girl killed. Snow White escapes and finds refuge with 7 dwarfs in the forest. But the queen discovers she is still alive. Disguised as an old woman, she gives Snow White a poisoned apple. The girl falls into a deep sleep. Eventually a prince arrives, breaks the spell, and Snow White lives happily ever after. At least, that is the version most people remember. But the original ending of this story was something very different. In the version recorded by the Grimm brothers, the evil queen is invited to Snow White's wedding. She does not yet realize the bride is the girl she tried to kill. When she arrives at the castle, she discovers the truth. The punishment that follows is one of the most brutal in all fairy tale history. Iron shoes are placed into a fire until they glow red hot. The queen is forced to put them on. Then she must dance in the burning shoes until she collapses and dies. This was the justice of the original tale. In early folklore, evil was not simply defeated. It was punished in a way no one could misunderstand. Why these stories were so harsh? To modern audiences, endings like this can seem shocking, but early fairy tales were not meant to comfort children. They were warnings about jealousy, cruelty, and betrayal. In a world without modern justice systems, stories often delivered their own form of punishment. And the message was simple. Cruelty would always return to the one who created it. Today, Snow White is remembered as a gentle story about kindness and friendship. But hidden beneath the version we know lies a darker tale. The poisoned apple itself may not be accidental symbolism. In European folklore, apples often represented temptation, knowledge, and danger. Long before the story of Snow White, apples already carried darker meanings in mythology. In some traditions, they were connected to death and enchantment. The idea of a beautiful fruit hiding poison was a warning often repeated in old stories. Not everything that appears harmless can be trusted. In Snow White's tale, the apple becomes the perfect weapon. It is ordinary, tempting, and innocent-looking, exactly the sort of thing a young girl might accept without suspicion. The queen met her justice. It came with fire and iron. To modern audiences, this punishment can seem shocking, but early fairy tales often ended with harsh justice. In these stories, evil was not simply defeated. It was meant to be seen, judged, and punished. Because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, dear listener, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Don't leave yet. We have more for you. While the story of Snow White tells of jealousy, beauty, and a cruel stepmother's attempts to destroy a young girl, the folklore collected by the brothers Grimm contains many similar stories where kindness and cruelty are tested in strange and magical ways. One such tale is known as The 3 Little Men in the Wood. In this story, a widower marries again, bringing a new wife and her daughter into the home he shares with his own child. The new wife quickly reveals her true nature. She favors her own daughter and treats her stepdaughter with cold cruelty. One winter day, she sends the girl deep into the forest during a heavy snowfall, ordering her to fill a basket with strawberries, an impossible task in the middle of winter. Lost and freezing, the girl eventually comes upon a small cottage hidden among the trees. Inside live 3 mysterious little men. The girl politely greets them, shares her small piece of bread, and even sweeps the snow from their doorstep. Pleased by her kindness, the little men reward her with 3 magical gifts. With each word she speaks, pieces of gold will fall from her mouth. She will grow more beautiful each day. And one day, she will become a queen. When the girl returns home with strawberries in her basket and gold falling from her lips, the stepmother becomes furious with jealousy. Determined that her own daughter should receive the same rewards, she sends her into the forest to find the cottage. But the girl is rude and selfish. She refuses to share her food, insults the little men, and refuses to help them. For her cruelty, the little men grant her 3 very different gifts. With every word she speaks, a toad will fall from her mouth, her beauty will fade, and she will meet an unhappy fate. Stories like this remind us that many fairy tales were not simply stories of magic, but warnings, tales that rewarded kindness and punished cruelty in ways that were sometimes as strange as they were severe. Thank you for listening to this episode of the dark origins of fairy tales. We hope you enjoyed it as much as us bringing it to you. Please leave a comment. Is there a dark origins of fairy tales you'd like to know more about? Subscribe and help us reach 50 subscribers. Turn on notifications and never miss another episode again. Hit the like button. Believe it or not, this actually helps the analytics. Hello, welcome, or welcome back. It's good to see you again. Take a seat, we're about to begin. The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. Series 1, Episode 4. Little Red Riding Hood, the version with no rescue. This one will surprise people, because the earliest versions are much darker and much shorter than modern tellings. The story was first written down by Charles Perrault in 1697, long before the brothers Grimm recorded their later version. And in Perrault's telling, there is no woodsman. Disclaimer. Caution. The Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were warnings, stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. What is a fairy tale? Before we begin tonight's story, a quick word about fairy tales. Fairy tales are some of the oldest stories ever told. Long before they were written in books, they were passed down through generations by word of mouth, told around fires, in homes, and in village squares. With every telling, the stories changed slightly, evolving into the versions we recognize today. Despite the name, fairy tales do not always involve fairies. Instead, they often include magic, curses, strange creatures, enchanted objects, and impossible journeys. Many of the versions we know today were recorded in the 19th century by collectors like the brothers Grimm, but the stories themselves are often far older. And while modern audiences often think of fairy tales as stories for children, the earliest versions were rarely so gentle. These stories were warnings, moral lessons, and reflections of the dangers and hardships of the world in which they were first told. In this series, we explore those earlier versions, the darker origins behind the stories many of us grew up with. Tonight's story is one of the most famous of them all. Most people know the story of Little Red Riding Hood. A young girl travels through the forest to visit her grandmother. Along the way, she meets a wolf. The wolf tricks her, reaches the grandmother's house first, and devours the old woman. Later, the wolf disguises himself as the grandmother and waits for the girl. But in the version most people remember, the story ends with a rescue. A woodsman arrives, cuts open the wolf, and saves both grandmother and child. It is a dramatic ending, but it was not part of the original story. The Perrault version. In 1697, the French writer Charles Perrault published the first written version of Little Red Riding Hood. In this version, the story is far simpler and far darker. The wolf tricks the girl into revealing where her grandmother lives. He arrives first and devours the old woman. Then he climbs into her bed and waits. When Little Red Riding Hood arrives, she begins to notice strange things about her grandmother. Her arms seem unusually large. Her ears seem unusually long. And of course, the famous line, "Grandmother, what big teeth you have." The wolf replies, "All the better to eat you with." And then he does exactly that. In Perrault's version, the story ends there. The wolf eats the girl. There is no rescue. The moral. Perrault included a clear moral at the end of the story. He warned young readers about strangers who might appear charming or harmless. In the moral, he compares dangerous men to wolves. The story was never meant to be comforting. It was meant to be a warning. The Grimm version. Later, in the 1800s, the brothers Grimm collected a different version of the story. This is the version most people know today. The Grimm brothers added the woodsman who rescues Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. They also softened the moral tone of the story. But the darker version recorded by Perrault remained the earliest written form. Why stories like this existed. In early European folklore, forests were dangerous places. Travelers could encounter bandits, wild animals, or worse. Stories like Little Red Riding Hood served as warnings for children. They taught lessons about trust, obedience, and caution, and the consequences of ignoring those lessons were often severe. Today, Little Red Riding Hood is remembered as a simple story about a girl in a red cloak and a talking wolf, but the earliest version was far more direct. A warning disguised as a fairy tale. Because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Please don't leave yet, we have more for you. The Wolf and the 7 Young Kids. While the tale of Little Red Riding Hood warns of a wolf disguised as a harmless grandmother, other stories collected by the brothers Grimm tell of similar dangers. One of these stories is called The Wolf and the 7 Young Kids. In this tale, a mother goat prepares to leave her home to gather food for her 7 young children. Before she goes, she warns them about the wolf who lives nearby. "The wolf will try to trick you," she tells them, "but you will know him by his rough voice and his black feet." Soon after she leaves, the wolf arrives at the door and calls out, pretending to be their mother. But the young goats hear his rough voice and refuse to open the door. Determined to deceive them, the wolf softens his voice by eating chalk and returns again. This time the children ask to see his feet beneath the door. When they see his black paws, they refuse him once more. Finally, the wolf covers his feet with flour to hide their color and returns to the cottage. Believing it is their mother, the young goats open the door. The wolf rushes inside and devours 6 of the children. Only the youngest survives by hiding inside the tall case of a grandfather clock. Later that day, the mother goat returns home and discovers the terrible scene. The youngest child tells her what happened. Together they search for the wolf and soon find him sleeping beneath a tree, his belly swollen from the meal. Carefully, the mother goat cuts open the wolf's stomach and rescues the 6 young goats, who are miraculously still alive. They fill the wolf's belly with heavy stones before sewing it closed. When the wolf awakens and tries to drink from a nearby well, the weight of the stones pulls him forward, and he falls in. Stories like this remind us that long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were often told as warnings. Stories meant to teach that danger can sometimes arrive wearing a familiar voice. We hope that you enjoyed this dark origins of fairy tales. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know about? Let us know. By leaving a comment, subscribe, help us reach 50 subs. turn on notifications, and never miss another episode again. If you've enjoyed this episode, hit the like button. It does help with the analytics. Return next week for a new dark origins of fairy tales as we look at Hansel and Gretel. Hello, welcome or welcome back. Please have a seat, we're about to begin. Disclaimer: caution. The Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were warnings. Stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. What is a fairy tale? Before we begin tonight's story, a quick word about fairy tales. Fairy tales are some of the oldest stories ever told. Long before they were written in books, they were passed down through generations by word of mouth, told around fires, in homes, and in village squares. With every telling, the stories changed slightly, evolving into the versions we recognize today. Despite the name, fairy tales do not always involve fairies. Instead, they often include magic, curses, strange creatures, enchanted objects, and impossible journeys. Many of the versions we know today were recorded in the 19th century by collectors like the brothers Grimm, but the stories themselves are often far older. And while modern audiences often think of fairy tales as stories for children, the earliest versions were rarely so gentle. These stories were warnings, moral lessons, and reflections of the dangers and hardships of the world in which they were first told. In this series, we explore those earlier versions, the darker origins behind the stories many of us grew up with. Tonight's story is one of the most famous of them all. Series 1, Episode 5. Hansel and Gretel, a story born from hunger. Most people know the story of Hansel and Gretel. Two children wander deep into a dark forest. Lost and frightened, they discover a strange house made of gingerbread and candy. Inside lives a witch who plans to fatten them up and eat them. But in the end, the children outsmart the witch and escape. It is a strange story, filled with magic and danger. But the darker truth behind Hansel and Gretel may come from something very real. Hunger, a world of famine. In medieval Europe, famine was a constant threat. Harvest failures could destroy entire communities. During the Great Famine of the early 14th century, millions of people across Europe starved. When food disappeared, families sometimes faced impossible choices. There are historical records suggesting that during extreme famine, some parents abandoned their children in forests because they could no longer feed them. Stories like Hansel and Gretel may have grown from these desperate realities. The Grimm version. In the version recorded by the brothers Grimm, the children's own stepmother convinces their father to leave them in the forest. She fears the family will starve if they remain. Hansel secretly leaves a trail of white stones to guide them home. The plan works the first time. But the second time the children are abandoned, Hansel uses breadcrumbs instead. Birds eat the crumbs, and the path disappears. Now the children are truly lost. The witch. When Hansel and Gretel find the gingerbread house, the old woman who lives there seems kind at first. but she is a cannibalistic witch who lures children into her trap. Hansel is locked in a cage to be fattened up. Gretel is forced to work as a servant. When the witch prepares to cook Hansel, Gretel tricks her into leaning over the oven. Then Gretel pushes the witch inside and slams the door. A brutal world. To modern audiences, Hansel and Gretel can seem like a strange and unsettling story. But in a world where famine and starvation were real threats, the story may have reflected fears that people understood all too well. Hunger could drive people to desperate acts, and the forest was often seen as a place where children might disappear forever. Today, Hansel and Gretel is remembered as a magical story about courage and survival. But behind the candy house and the wicked witch may lie echoes of something far darker. A time when hunger shaped the stories people told their children. Because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Please don't leave yet. We have another story for you. The Juniper Tree. While the story of Hansel and Gretel tells of children abandoned in the forest, some of the darkest fairy tales collected by the brothers Grimm explore even more disturbing themes. One of the most infamous of these stories is known as the Juniper Tree. In this tale, a wealthy merchant lives with his second wife and his 2 children, a young daughter and a son from his first marriage. The stepmother despises the boy and envies the love his father shows him. One afternoon, she lures the child to a heavy wooden chest and tells him that he may take an apple from inside. When the boy bends down to reach into the chest, she suddenly slams the lid shut, cutting off his head. Horrified at what she has done, the woman quickly places the boy's head back onto his body and ties a scarf around his neck to hide the wound. When the daughter later approaches her brother, she asks him for an apple. When he does not respond, she strikes him in frustration, and his head falls from his shoulders. The stepmother then convinces the terrified girl that the death was her fault. To hide the crime, the woman cuts the boy's body into pieces and cooks it into a stew. That evening, the father returns home and unknowingly eats the meal prepared for him, praising its flavor. Meanwhile, the daughter secretly gathers her brother's bones and places them beneath the branches of a juniper tree growing in the yard. Soon, a strange and beautiful bird emerges from the tree. The bird begins to sing a haunting song describing the murder of the boy. It flies through the town, repeating the story, gathering gifts from those who hear its song: a gold chain, a pair of red shoes, and a heavy millstone. Finally, the bird returns to the house where the crime was committed. It gives the gold chain to the father and the red shoes to the sister. But when the stepmother steps outside to hear the bird's song, the bird drops the millstone upon her head, killing her instantly. In that moment, the bird transforms back into the murdered boy, restored to life beneath the branches of the juniper tree. And the family is finally reunited. Stories like the juniper tree remind us that many early fairy tales were not gentle bedtime stories, but powerful tales of betrayal, justice, and revenge. We at the Ember and Ink Studios like to thank you for listening to our Dark Origins of Fairy Tales series. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know more about? Leave us a comment. If you've enjoyed this tale, or you're enjoying the series, why not consider subscribing? Help us reach 50 subs. Turn on notifications and never miss another episode again. It's totally free, I promise. And smash the thumbs up button, because it does really help with the analytics. Be sure to return next week when the Ember and Ink Studios bring you Episode 6, Rapunzel, The Secret Hidden in the Tower. Hello, welcome, or welcome back. It's good to see you again. Please take a seat. We're about to begin. Disclaimer. Caution. The Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were warnings, stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. What is a fairy tale? Before we begin tonight's story, a quick word about fairy tales. Fairy tales are some of the oldest stories ever told. Long before they were written in books, they were passed down through generations by word of mouth, told around fires, in homes, and in village squares. With every telling, the stories changed slightly, evolving into the versions we recognize today. Despite the name, fairy tales do not always involve fairies. Instead, they often include magic, curses, strange creatures, enchanted objects, and impossible journeys. Many of the versions we know today were recorded in the 19th century by collectors like the brothers Grimm, but the stories themselves are often far older. And while modern audiences often think of fairy tales as stories for children, the earliest versions were rarely so gentle. These stories were warnings, moral lessons, and reflections of the dangers and hardships of the world in which they were first told. In this series, we explore those earlier versions, the darker origins behind the stories many of us grew up with. Tonight's story is one of the most famous of them all. Series 1, Episode 6, Rapunzel, The Secret Hidden in the Tower. Most people know the story of Rapunzel. A beautiful young girl is locked in a tall tower by a wicked witch. With no door and no staircase, the only way to reach the tower is by climbing her long, golden hair. Eventually, a prince discovers the tower and secretly visits Rapunzel. But in the version most people know today, the story remains fairly simple. The prince rescues Rapunzel, and the two escape together. The end. But the original Grimm version tells a slightly different story, one that reveals something the witch eventually discovers. How Rapunzel was taken. In the Grimm version, Rapunzel's story begins before she is even born. Her mother becomes obsessed with a plant growing in a neighboring garden. This garden belongs to a powerful sorceress. The plant is called Rapunzel, a type of leafy vegetable similar to rampion. When Rapunzel's father is caught stealing the plant, the sorceress demands payment. The couple must give her their child once it is born. And so Rapunzel is taken. The tower. As Rapunzel grows older, the sorceress locks her inside a tall tower deep in the forest. There is no door, no staircase, only a small window high above the ground. When the sorceress wishes to enter the tower, she calls out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel lowers her long golden braid, and the sorceress climbs up. One day, a prince hears Rapunzel singing from the tower and discovers the secret. Soon he begins visiting her in secret. But their meetings do not remain secret forever. The discovery. In the original Grimm version, Rapunzel eventually reveals the truth herself. One day she innocently says to the sorceress, "Why is it that my dress is becoming so tight?" With that simple sentence, the witch realizes the truth. Rapunzel has become pregnant. Furious, the sorceress cuts off Rapunzel's hair and abandons her in the wilderness. The prince's fate. When the prince returns to the tower, he calls out as usual. But instead of Rapunzel, the sorceress lowers the long braid. When the prince climbs into the tower, the witch confronts him. In despair, the prince leaps from the tower. He survives the fall, but lands among thorns that blind him. For years he wanders the wilderness, until one day he hears a familiar voice. Rapunzel. Her tears fall onto his eyes and restore his sight. And the two are finally reunited. Why stories like this changed. In early fairy tales, stories often reflected real social fears. Pregnancy outside of marriage, isolation, and punishment were themes that appeared frequently. Over time, many of these details were softened or removed as fairy tales became stories told primarily to children. But the original versions often contained lessons meant for older audiences. Today, Rapunzel is remembered as a magical story about a girl with impossibly long hair trapped in a tower. But the original version reveals a much more complicated tale, one that included secrets, exile, and years of suffering. Because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Please stay with us as we give you another story from the dark origins of fairy tales, The Maiden Without Hands. While Rapunzel tells of a young woman imprisoned in a tower, other fairy tales collected by the brothers Grimm tell of even harsher trials faced by those who wish to protect their freedom. One of the most haunting of these stories is called The Maiden Without Hands. In this tale, a poor miller one day meets a mysterious stranger in the forest. The stranger promises the miller great wealth in exchange for whatever stands behind his house. Believing the stranger is speaking of his apple tree, the miller agrees. But when he returns home, he realizes with horror that the stranger was no ordinary traveler. It was the devil himself, and what stood behind the miller's house was his own daughter. The girl is pure and devout, and the devil cannot claim her as long as she remains untouched by sin. Furious, the devil commands the miller to remove her hands so she cannot defend herself. Terrified and desperate, the miller obeys. Rather than live under the devil's claim, the young woman leaves home and wanders the world alone, her hands gone and her future uncertain. After a long journey, she finds refuge in a royal garden, where the king discovers her kindness and courage. Despite her condition, he marries her. But the devil is not finished with her. Through trickery and false messages, he causes the king to believe his wife and newborn child have vanished. The young queen once again leaves the kingdom and wanders the wilderness, raising her child in hiding. Years later, the king finally discovers the truth and searches for his lost family. When they are reunited, the queen's hands are miraculously restored. Stories like The Maiden Without Hands remind us that many fairy tales were not merely stories of magic, but tales of endurance, stories of people who survived terrible trials before finding peace. Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this tale. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know more about? please leave us a comment. Help us reach 50 subs by subscribing and turning on the notifications, and never miss another episode again. If you'd like to help us with YouTube analytics, press the like button. Be sure to return next week when the Ember and Ink Studios presents Series 1, Episode 7, Rumpelstiltskin, The Price of a Child. Hello, welcome, or welcome back. We're about to start. Please take a seat, sit back, and enjoy our tale. Disclaimer. Caution. The Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were warnings. Stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. What is a fairy tale? Before we begin tonight's story, a quick word about fairy tales. Fairy tales are some of the oldest stories ever told. Long before they were written in books, they were passed down through generations by word of mouth, told around fires, in homes, and in village squares. With every telling, the stories changed slightly, evolving into the versions we recognize today. Despite the name, fairy tales do not always involve fairies. Instead, they often include magic, curses, strange creatures, enchanted objects, and impossible journeys. Many of the versions we know today were recorded in the 19th century by collectors like the brothers Grimm, but the stories themselves are often far older. And while modern audiences often think of fairy tales as stories for children, the earliest versions were rarely so gentle. These stories were warnings, moral lessons, and reflections of the dangers and hardships of the world in which they were first told. In this series, we explore those earlier versions, the darker origins behind the stories many of us grew up with. Tonight's story is one of the most famous of them all. Series 1, Episode 7, Rumpelstiltskin, The Price of a Child. Most people know the story of Rumpelstiltskin. A poor miller boasts that his daughter can spin straw into gold. When the king hears this, he demands proof. The girl is locked in a room filled with straw and ordered to spin it into gold by morning. If she fails, she will die. But if she succeeds, the king promises to marry her. Faced with an impossible task, the girl begins to cry. Then a strange little man appears. He offers to spin the straw into gold for a price. The bargain. The first night, the girl gives the strange man a necklace. The second night, she gives him a ring. But on the third night, she has nothing left to offer. So the little man makes a new bargain. If she becomes queen, she must give him her firstborn child. Desperate to survive, she agrees. The straw becomes gold, and the king keeps his promise. She becomes queen. The debt comes due. Years later, the queen gives birth to a child. Soon after, the strange little man returns to claim what he was promised. The queen begs him to spare the child. The little man agrees to give her a chance. If she can guess his name within 3 days, the child may remain with her. The secret name. After many failed guesses, a messenger reports something strange. While traveling through the forest, he saw a small man dancing around a fire. As he danced, he sang a song revealing his name, Rumpelstiltskin. When the queen finally speaks the name aloud, the little man realizes he has been tricked. In the Grimm version, his rage is uncontrollable. He stamps his foot so hard that it sinks deep into the ground. Then, in his fury, he tears himself apart. The meaning behind the story. Stories like Rumpelstiltskin often reflect old European beliefs about supernatural beings. In many traditions, knowing a spirit's true name gave a person power over it. The tale also carries a warning about promises made in desperation. A bargain made to escape danger can return years later with a terrible price. Today, Rumpelstiltskin is remembered as a strange fairy tale about a magical man who spins straw into gold. But beneath the story lies an older warning about greed, deception, and the dangers of promises that cannot be undone. Because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Please don't leave yet. We have another fascinating story for you to enjoy. The Fisherman and His Wife. While the story of Rumpelstiltskin tells of a desperate bargain made for power and survival, many fairy tales collected by the brothers Grimm explore what happens when people ask for more than they should. One of the most famous examples is a story known as The Fisherman and His Wife. In this tale, a poor fisherman lives with his wife in a small, miserable hut near the sea. One day, while casting his net, the fisherman catches an unusual fish. To his surprise, the fish begins to speak. The fish reveals that he is an enchanted prince and begs the fisherman to release him. The fisherman, being kind-hearted, lets the fish go without asking for anything in return. When he returns home and tells his wife what happened, she is furious. "You caught a magical fish and asked for nothing?" she scolds him. "Go back and ask for a better house." Reluctantly, the fisherman returns to the sea and calls for the enchanted fish. The fish grants the wish, and the couple soon finds themselves living in a fine cottage. But the wife is not satisfied. Soon she demands a castle. Then she wishes to become a queen. Each time the fisherman returns to the sea, the water grows darker and more restless. Still, the enchanted fish grants the wishes, but the wife's greed grows without limit. Eventually, she demands to become an empress. Then she wishes to become pope. And finally, in her arrogance, she demands the ultimate power. She wishes to become like God. When the fisherman returns to the sea with this final demand, the stormy waters rage violently. The enchanted fish rises once more and quietly speaks. "Go home," the fish tells him. When the fisherman returns, he finds that everything has vanished. The castle, the throne, the power, all gone. Once again, he and his wife sit together in their small, miserable hut by the sea. Stories like The Fisherman and His Wife remind us that many fairy tales warned against the dangers of endless ambition, and how quickly everything can be lost when people ask for more than the world was ever meant to give. We at the Ember and Ink Studios hope you enjoyed this tale. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know more about? Please leave a comment, help us reach 50 subs, subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss another episode again. And give us a thumbs up. Be sure to return next week for episode 8, Jack and the Beanstalk, the giant stolen gold. Hello, welcome, and/or welcome back. The Ember and Ink Studios are proud to present the final dark origins of fairy tales in this series. Please have a seat, we're about to begin. Disclaimer, caution. The Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were warnings. Stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in the dark origins of fairy tales. What is a fairy tale? Before we begin tonight's story, a quick word about fairy tales. Fairy tales are some of the oldest stories ever told. Long before they were written in books, they were passed down through generations by word of mouth, told around fires, in homes, and in village squares. With every telling, the stories changed slightly, evolving into the versions we recognize today. Despite the name, fairy tales do not always involve fairies. Instead, they often include magic, curses, strange creatures, enchanted objects, and impossible journeys. Many of the versions we know today were recorded in the 19th century by collectors like the brothers Grimm. But the stories themselves are often far older. And while modern audiences often think of fairy tales as stories for children, the earliest versions were rarely so gentle. These stories were warnings, moral lessons, and reflections of the dangers and hardships of the world in which they were first told. In this series, we explore those earlier versions, the darker origins behind the stories many of us grew up with. Tonight's story is one of the most famous of them all. Series 1, Episode 8, Jack and the Beanstalk, the Giant's Stolen Gold. Most people know the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. A poor boy trades the family cow for a handful of magical beans. His mother is furious and throws the beans out the window. But overnight, a gigantic beanstalk grows into the clouds. Jack climbs the beanstalk and discovers a giant's castle in the sky. Inside the castle, he steals a bag of gold, a magical hen that lays golden eggs, and a singing harp. Eventually, the giant chases Jack down the beanstalk. Jack cuts the stalk, and the giant falls to his death. It is usually told as a story of bravery and adventure. But when we look closer, the story becomes more complicated. The question of the giant. In many versions of the story, the giant is presented as a monster. But the castle, the gold, the hen, and the harp all belonged to the giant. Jack enters the castle without permission, and then he steals the giant's treasure. In other words, Jack may actually be the thief. Earlier versions of the story, the version most people know was popularized by Joseph Jacobs in the late 19th century. But the story likely grew from much older English folklore about giants and magical treasure. In some interpretations, Jack's father had originally been robbed by the giant, making Jack's actions a form of revenge. But this detail does not appear in every version. Without it, the story takes on a different tone. Trickster heroes. Jack fits into a long tradition of folklore characters known as tricksters. These characters survive by being clever rather than strong. They steal from powerful enemies and escape through quick thinking. Stories about tricksters often blurred the line between hero and villain. Jack may defeat the giant, but he also lies, trespasses, and steals. A different perspective. To modern audiences, the story of Jack and the Beanstalk often feels like a simple adventure. But when viewed from another perspective, it raises uncomfortable questions. What if the giant was simply defending his home? What if Jack was not the hero, but the intruder? Today, Jack and the Beanstalk is remembered as a magical story about a boy who climbs into the clouds and defeats a giant. But the deeper meaning of the story may lie in a different lesson. Sometimes the hero of a story depends entirely on who is telling it. Because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. Please don't leave yet. We have another story for you. Jack the Giant Killer. While the story of Jack and the Beanstalk tells of a clever boy who climbs into the realm of giants, English folklore preserved another legend about a young hero named Jack, one who made a name for himself, not by stealing from giants, but by defeating them. This story is known as Jack the Giant Killer, a famous folk tale from the southwest of England that dates back hundreds of years. According to the legend, the countryside was once terrorized by enormous giants who lived in caves and castles among the hills. One of the most feared of these creatures was a giant named Cormoran, who lived on a nearby mountain and regularly raided villages for food. A young man named Jack decided that someone had to stop him. Rather than challenge the giant in open combat, Jack used his intelligence. During the night, he secretly dug a deep pit near the giant's path and covered it with branches and soil. When the giant came searching for his next meal, he stepped onto the hidden trap and fell into the pit. Jack quickly buried the giant beneath stones and dirt, defeating the monster without ever facing him directly. As word of his victory spread, Jack became known throughout the land as a giant killer. But his adventures were far from over. In later tales, Jack uses clever tricks to defeat other giants, hiding inside ovens, escaping traps, and outwitting creatures far larger than himself. Stories like Jack the Giant Killer remind us that many early folk heroes were not powerful warriors, but ordinary people who survived through courage and clever thinking. And in many ways, the famous tale of Jack and the Beanstalk echoes the same idea, that even in a world of giants, a small and determined hero can change his fate. The Ember and Ink Studios hope you've enjoyed this series of the dark origins of fairy tales. Please leave a comment, hit the like button, and subscribe. Be sure to return next week for an original story, The Garden of Dreams.